There is something fundamentally different about the way an empath experiences the world, and most people will never fully understand it. For the average person, social interaction is often straightforward. Words are taken at face value. Smiles are accepted as genuine. Conversations are processed through logic, surface cues, and direct meaning. But for an empath, communication rarely works that way. An empath does not simply hear what is being said. They feel what is being left unsaid. They notice the hesitation before someone answers. They sense the tension hidden behind forced laughter. They pick up on the emotional contradictions between a person's words and their actual internal state. They can often feel discomfort behind confidence, sadness behind humor, resentment behind politeness. And this changes everything. Because when you experience people at that depth, social interaction becomes far more complex than it appears on the surface. What others may experience as a simple casual conversation, an empath often experiences as an emotional exchange layered with invisible information. Every interaction carries weight. Every room carries energy. Every person projects something. Whether they realize it or not, and empaths absorb it. This is one of the biggest reasons many empaths end up with very few friends. It is not because they dislike people. It is not because they are antisocial. And it is certainly not because they lack the ability to connect. In fact, empaths often connect more deeply and more quickly than most people ever do. The problem is not their inability to connect. The problem is the emotional cost of connecting with the wrong people. When you naturally absorb emotional energy, being around certain people becomes exhausting in ways that are difficult to explain. Some people drain the room the moment they enter it. Some carry unresolved chaos that spills into every interaction. Some speak kindly while carrying hidden envy, judgment, or emotional instability beneath the surface. Most people can ignore this. An empath cannot. They feel it all. And over time, this heightened sensitivity forces them to become selective. They begin noticing that not every friendship feels safe. Not every connection feels peaceful. Not every relationship nourishes. Some simply deplete. This is often where the empath begins withdrawing from. Large social circles. What looks like distance to the outside world is often emotional self-preservation. They are not isolating because they think they are better than others. They are protecting themselves from the exhaustion that comes from constantly carrying emotional frequencies that do not belong to them. And this can be incredibly lonely at times, because many empaths genuinely long for connection. They want friendship. They want understanding. They want people they can trust and feel at ease with. But they would rather stand alone in peace than stay surrounded by people whose energy leaves them feeling emotionally fractured. This is a level of discernment that often comes only through experience. After enough emotionally draining relationships, enough subtle betrayals, enough interactions that leave them feeling heavy and depleted, the empath begins to trust what they feel. They stop ignoring their instincts. They stop forcing connections that feel wrong. They stop apologizing for needing distance. And that is when their social circle often becomes very small, not because they have less love to give, but because they finally understand that their emotional sensitivity is not a weakness to suppress. It is intelligence to honor. Because when you feel the world more deeply than most, protecting your energy is no longer optional. It becomes essential. There is another trait that often defines empaths who have very few friends. And it is one of the most misunderstood aspects of who they are. They are not searching for quantity. They are searching for depth. This is something the modern world often struggles to understand because so much of social culture has become built around appearance, accessibility, and constant connection. People are encouraged to collect relationships the same way they collect followers, contacts, and casual interactions. The more people you know, the more socially successful you are assumed to be. But an empath does not think that way. To them, connection is not measured by how many names are in their phone or how many people they can casually call friends. Connection is measured by emotional truth. It is measured by whether they can sit across from someone and feel sincerity, whether they can speak honestly without needing to filter themselves, whether silence between them feels peaceful rather than awkward, whether the relationship creates emotional safety instead of emotional performance. and because their standards for connection are rooted in authenticity, empaths often find themselves stepping away from relationships that others would easily maintain. This is not because they are difficult to please. It is because shallow interaction often feels deeply unsatisfying to them. Surface-level friendships can feel emotionally empty. Small talk can feel draining. Conversations built on appearances, gossip, status, or pretense often leave an empath feeling disconnected even when surrounded by people. This is one of the loneliest experiences an empath can have, being physically present with others while feeling emotionally absent from the interaction, because what they crave is something deeper. They want conversations that move beyond the scripted responses people use to avoid vulnerability. They want honesty. They want emotional presence. They want to know what someone actually thinks, what they actually feel, what they are truly carrying beneath the polished surface they show the world. And when they cannot find that level of openness, they often retreat, not out of judgment, not because they think others are beneath them, but because forced connection drains them far more than solitude ever could. This is why empaths often have very small circles. When they do call someone a friend, that word carries real weight. It is not casual. It is not convenient. It is earned. Because for an empath, friendship is not about passing time. It is about shared emotional resonance. It is about mutual trust. It is about being able to exist without masks. And the truth is, relationships built at that level are rare. Many people are comfortable staying on the surface because depth requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires courage. Not everyone is willing to go there. But the empath cannot stay where things are emotionally shallow for long. Their nature pulls them toward what is real, toward conversations that matter, toward people who are emotionally awake enough to meet them in sincerity. And until they find those people, they are often perfectly willing to walk alone. This is where so many people misunderstand them. They assume the empath is isolated because they struggle socially. In reality, many empaths are simply unwilling to trade authenticity for access. They would rather have one relationship rooted in truth than 20 built on convenience. They would rather spend an evening in peaceful solitude than force themselves into connections that feel hollow. Because they understand something many people spend years trying to learn. Being surrounded by people means nothing if your soul still feels unseen. And that is why an empath will always choose depth over numbers. There is a pattern that shows up again and again in the lives of empaths who have very few friends. And if you look closely, it reveals something profound about the way they move through relationships. Most of them did not become selective by accident. They became selective through experience. Because if there is one thing that defines an empath, it is their natural instinct to give. They give their time freely. They give their attention fully. They listen deeply, care genuinely, and often show up for others with a level of emotional presence that is increasingly rare in this world. When someone is hurting, the empath feels it. When someone is struggling, the empath wants to help. When someone feels unseen, the empath often becomes. He is the one person willing to truly understand. And while this is one of their greatest strengths, it can also become one of their greatest vulnerabilities. Because not everyone receives that kind of compassion with gratitude. Some people receive it with expectation. Some receive it with entitlement. And some quietly recognize the empath's giving nature and begin taking from it without ever intending to give anything back. This is where so many empaths get hurt. In the beginning, they often assume that if they continue giving, continue understanding, continue being patient and supportive, the relationship will eventually balance itself. They believe their care will be reciprocated. They trust that the emotional energy they invest will be honored. But over time, reality teaches them otherwise. They begin noticing the imbalance. They notice they are always the one checking in, always the one listening, always the one understanding, always the one making space for everyone else's emotions while receiving very little emotional care in return. And because empaths are often deeply compassionate, they can tolerate this imbalance far longer than they should. They make excuses. They rationalize behavior. They convince themselves that people are just going through difficult seasons. They keep giving, hoping the connection will eventually become mutual. But eventually, something shifts. There comes a moment when the empath realizes they are not in a friendship. They are in an emotional transaction where they have become the resource, and that realization changes everything. Because betrayal for an empath is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is the quiet realization that someone enjoyed their support but never valued their humanity. Sometimes it is recognizing that people loved what they provided but never truly cared for who they were. That kind of pain leaves a lasting mark. It teaches the empath to pause, to observe more carefully, to question intentions, to stop mistaking emotional neediness for genuine connection. This is why many empaths eventually become incredibly selective about friendship. What looks like guardedness from the outside is often wisdom forged through repeated disappointment. They have learned that access to their energy must be earned. That kindness without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. That generosity without discernment invites exploitation. And perhaps most importantly, they learn that protecting themselves is not selfish. It is necessary. So they begin choosing differently. They stop chasing people. They stop over-explaining. They stop pouring into relationships that consistently leave them empty. Instead, they wait. They observe. They allow people to reveal who they truly are through consistency, reciprocity, and emotional integrity. And if that means having fewer friends, they accept it. Because after giving too much to the wrong people, the empath finally understands a truth that reshapes everything. It is far better to walk alone than to keep pouring your soul into those who only came to drink from it. There comes a point in the life of many empaths when they begin to understand something that completely changes the way they relate to the world. Peace is expensive, and the price is often distance. This is one of the clearest traits you will notice in empaths who have very few friends. At some point, they stopped prioritizing popularity and started prioritizing emotional stability. This shift usually does not happen overnight. It happens gradually, through the experience, through the exhaustion of being pulled into unnecessary drama, through the emotional fatigue of trying to maintain relationships built on chaos, inconsistency, or constant tension, through the repeated realization that many social connections demand far more energy than they ever return. And eventually, the empath reaches a quiet but powerful conclusion. Not every relationship is worth the cost of your peace. This is where their perspective begins to differ dramatically from the people around them. Many people are willing to tolerate emotional turbulence just to avoid being alone. They will remain connected to people who drain them, disrespect them, manipulate them, or consistently disrupt their inner balance simply because they fear solitude. The empath eventually learns to see this differently. They discover that loneliness and peace are not the same thing. You can be surrounded by people and still feel deeply alone, and you can be physically alone while feeling profoundly at peace. Once they experience the emotional clarity that comes from stepping away from draining relationships, everything changes. They begin to notice how much lighter life feels without constant emotional noise, how much clearer their thoughts become, how much more stable their energy feels, how deeply restorative silence can be when it is no longer interrupted by unnecessary chaos. And this is when many empaths start making decisions that others often misunderstand. They decline invitations. They distance themselves from emotionally unpredictable people. They stop forcing social interactions out of obligation. They become highly intentional about who they allow into their personal space. To some, this can look cold. It can look detached. It can even appear antisocial. But the truth is far more powerful. This is not withdrawal. This is refinement. The empath has simply learned that protecting their peace is one of the highest forms of self-respect. They understand that every relationship carries an energetic cost. Every conversation, every expectation, every emotional exchange. And because they feel these exchanges so deeply, they cannot afford to spend their energy carelessly. This is why many empaths would rather spend a quiet evening alone than sit in a room full of forced interaction, gossip, hidden tension, or emotional performance. It is not because they reject people. It is because they reject emotional environments that disturb their inner balance. They have learned that peace is not something you find by accident. It is something you protect through conscious choices. Sometimes that means disappointing people. Sometimes it means walking away from relationships others expect you to maintain. Sometimes it means being misunderstood by those who cannot comprehend why someone would choose solitude over social acceptance. But the empath learns to accept this, because once you have experienced genuine peace, popularity begins to lose its appeal. The approval of many can never compete with the calm that comes from emotional freedom, and so they choose carefully. They keep their circle small. They guard their energy fiercely. They build lives centered not around attention, but around alignment. Because in the end, the empath understands one simple truth. A quiet life filled with peace will always be worth more than a crowded life filled with chaos. And if you follow this pattern all the way to its deepest point, you arrive at perhaps the most defining trait of all. Empaths who have very few friends of. They tend to possess something many people spend their entire lives trying to develop. A strong, honest relationship with themselves. This is the part most people overlook. When they see someone with a very small social circle, they often assume something must be missing. They assume the person is lonely, disconnected, or somehow lacking the social ability to create relationships. But with empaths, that assumption is often completely wrong, because what looks like absence on the outside is often fullness on the inside. Many empaths have spent years turning inward, reflecting, healing, learning, questioning who they are, what they value, and what kind of life truly aligns with their nature. And through that process, they often build a level of self-awareness that fundamentally changes how they relate to other people. They come to know themselves deeply. They understand their emotional patterns. They recognize what drains them and what restores them. They become familiar with their own inner landscape, their fears, their strengths, their wounds, their growth. And once someone reaches that level of internal clarity, something remarkable happens. They stop depending on other people to complete him. This is what sets many empaths apart. Their solitude is often not emptiness. It is self-connection. While others may constantly seek distraction through social interaction, the empath often finds nourishment in stillness, in quiet reflection, in their own thoughts, in the peace of not needing to perform, explain, or adapt themselves to fit the expectations of others. They become comfortable in their own company, and that comfort creates freedom. Because once you genuinely enjoy your own presence, desperation disappears. You no longer seek relationships out of fear of being alone. You no longer tolerate emotional misalignment simply to maintain company. You no longer confuse external attention with internal worth. This changes everything. The empath becomes far less willing to compromise their peace for the sake of connection. They begin approaching relationships from wholeness rather than need, and this is why they often have so few friends. They are not searching for someone to fill a void. They are searching for people who can genuinely add to an already meaningful inner life. That is an entirely different standard. It means they can wait. It means they can walk away. It means they can remain alone without feeling incomplete. And to a world that often equates constant social engagement with happiness, this kind of independence can seem strange. Some people cannot understand how someone can spend so much time alone and still feel fulfilled. But empaths understand something many people have not yet learned. The quality of your relationship with yourself shapes the quality of every other relationship you will ever have. If you cannot sit peacefully with yourself, you will often seek people as escape. If you cannot validate yourself, you will constantly chase validation from others. If you do not know yourself, you will accept relationships that pull you further away from who you are. The empath has usually learned these lessons through deep personal reflection, and because of that, they become incredibly selective about who enters their life. Not from arrogance, not from fear, but from self-respect. Because once you have built a life where your own company feels like peace, you stop making room for anything that feels like emotional noise. And that is when solitude stops being loneliness and becomes strength.